I want to tell you about something that happened in the latter half of 2025 that fundamentally changes global energy markets and represents a strategic nightmare for the United States. Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, two of the world's largest oil producers, have reached an agreement to coordinate oil production and pricing. And this isn't just about managing supply. This is about two countries that were on opposite sides of every geopolitical divide, finding common ground in ways that directly challenge American energy strategy. Let me explain why this matters and what's actually changing on the ground, because the implications go far beyond oil prices at the pump. Start with the basic facts. Saudi Arabia controls roughly 12% of global oil production, about 11 million barrels per day at current rates. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, even larger than Saudi Arabia's, estimated at over 300 billion barrels. For years, those reserves have been largely inaccessible due to underinvestment, mismanagement, and crippling U.S. sanctions that have decimated Venezuelan oil production from 3.5 million barrels per day in the 1990s to under 800,000 barrels per day by 2020. But things have changed by December 2025. Venezuelan production has recovered to approximately 1.2 million barrels per day and is climbing. How? Because sanctions enforcement has weakened, because Chinese and Russian companies have invested in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, and because countries including China, India, and Turkey are buying Venezuelan oil despite American objections. And now Saudi Arabia, America's traditional partner in managing global oil markets, has decided that coordinating with Venezuela serves Saudi interests better than exclusive alignment with U.S. energy policy. The deal that's emerged involves several components. First, production coordination. Saudi Arabia and Venezuela are consulting on output levels to manage global supply in ways that maintain prices at levels both countries find acceptable, generally in the $75 to $85 per barrel range. When prices fall below that, they reduce supply. When prices rise too high and risk demand destruction or accelerating the energy transition, they increase supply. Second, market division. Saudi Arabia focuses on Asian markets, China, India, Japan, South Korea, where demand growth is concentrated. Venezuela focuses on supplying customers willing to work around or ignore U.S. sanctions, China primarily, but also some Latin American countries, and through third-party refiners, even some European markets indirectly. Third, political coordination. Both countries are aligning positions at OPEC and in international forums to counter American pressure on energy policy. They're presenting a united front against U.S. attempts to force production increases to lower prices. Now let me tell you why Saudi Arabia, a country that has coordinated with the United States on oil policy for 50 years, is making this pivot. First, the petrodollar system has effectively ended. The June 2024 expiration of the U.S.-Saudi petrodollar agreement means Saudi Arabia is no longer committed to pricing oil exclusively in dollars or recycling oil revenues into U.S. Treasury bonds. This removes the foundational economic incentive that tied Saudi energy policy to American interests. If Saudi Arabia doesn't need to maintain dollar dominance, they don't need to coordinate oil policy with Washington. Second, Riyadh is increasingly frustrated with American energy policy, the Biden administration's focus on renewable energy transition, the rhetoric about ending oil dependence, the occasional threats to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for production decisions. All of this convinced Saudi leaders that America views oil producers as obstacles to be overcome rather than partners to be valued. Why coordinate with a country that's working to destroy your industry? Third, Saudi Arabia's largest customers are now in Asia, particularly China. Beijing wants stable, affordable oil supplies to fuel economic growth. China also wants oil priced in yuan rather than dollars. Saudi Arabia has decided that accommodating its largest customers' preferences makes strategic sense, if that means coordinating with Venezuela, a major oil producer that also sells primarily to China, so be it. Fourth, Vision 2030 and Saudi economic diversification require massive oil revenues now. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman needs high oil prices to finance the mega projects that are supposed to transform the Saudi economy. NEOM, the Red Sea project, entertainment cities, technology hubs. Low oil prices undermine the entire diversification strategy. So Saudi Arabia prioritizes revenue maximization over accommodating American preferences for lower prices. Fifth, Venezuela represents a test case. If Saudi Arabia can work with a country that the United States has tried to isolate and regime change for 2 decades, it demonstrates Saudi independence. It signals to Washington that Riyadh has options, that the relationship is no longer one-sided, that American demands will be evaluated based on Saudi interests, not automatically accepted. For Venezuela, the motivations are straightforward. President Nicolas Maduro's regime has survived American sanctions through a combination of support from Russia and China, selling oil to buyers willing to ignore U.S. pressure, and maintaining enough domestic control through repression and patronage to prevent collapse. But survival isn't prosperity. Venezuela needs higher oil production and better prices to restore economic stability. Coordinating with Saudi Arabia gives Venezuela legitimacy. If the dominant OPEC producer treats Venezuela as a partner rather than a pariah, other countries are more likely to do business with Caracas. It also gives Venezuela protection. If Saudi Arabia wants Venezuelan oil off the market during certain periods to tighten supply, they can coordinate production cuts. If Saudis want more supply to prevent prices from spiking too high, Venezuelan increase helps without Saudi Arabia having to sacrifice its own production levels. The Chinese connection is crucial to understanding this deal. China is the world's largest oil importer, bringing in over 11 million barrels per day. China wants diverse suppliers so no single country has too much leverage. China also wants to reduce dependence on oil that transits through the Strait of Malacca, which the U.S. Navy could theoretically blockade in a conflict. Venezuelan oil coming across the Pacific provides geographic diversification. China has invested billions in Venezuelan oil infrastructure through companies like CNPC and Sinopec. These investments have helped stabilize and gradually increase Venezuelan production. China buys roughly 500,000 to 600,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan oil, paying in yuan and accepting repayment of Venezuelan debts through oil deliveries. This creates a closed loop that doesn't involve dollars or Western financial systems. Saudi Arabia's coordination with Venezuela indirectly serves Chinese interests by ensuring stable supplies from multiple sources at prices that don't spike but remain high enough to incentivize production. Beijing has likely encouraged this coordination as part of its broader strategy to reshape global energy markets away from dollar dominance and U.S. control. Russia's role can't be ignored either. Russian oil companies, particularly Rosneft, have been deeply involved in Venezuela for years, helping maintain production despite sanctions. Russia has also coordinated with Saudi Arabia through OPEC Plus arrangements since 2016. The three-way dynamic, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, creates an alignment of major oil producers that operate increasingly outside U.S. influence. Now, let me tell you what this means for the United States, because the implications are profound and largely negative for American interests. First, oil price control is slipping away. For decades, the United States could influence global oil prices through its relationship with Saudi Arabia. When prices were too high, threatening economic growth, Washington could press Riyadh to increase production. When prices were too low, threatening U.S. shale producers, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia could coordinate production cuts. That lever is weakening. If Saudi Arabia coordinates with Venezuela, Russia, and others based on their shared interest in higher prices, American preferences become less relevant. Second, sanctions effectiveness is eroding. U.S. sanctions on Venezuelan oil were supposed to economically strangle the Maduro regime and force political change. Instead, Venezuela has survived by selling to China and other buyers willing to ignore American pressure. Now, with Saudi coordination giving Venezuela additional legitimacy and market access, sanctions become even less effective. This demonstrates to other sanctioned countries, Iran, Russia, that U.S. sanctions can be weathered and overcome. Third, the dollar's role in energy markets continues declining. Venezuelan Chinese oil trade happens in yuan. An increasing percentage of Saudi-Chinese oil trade settles in yuan. As these arrangements become normalized and expand, dollar demand from energy transactions falls. This contributes to the broader erosion of dollar dominance that undermines American financial power. Fourth, energy security for U.S. allies becomes more complex. Japan, South Korea, European countries, they all need reliable oil supplies. If major producers are coordinating in ways that prioritize their own revenue over consumer preferences, if they're willing to restrict supply to maintain high prices, importing countries face more expensive and less secure energy. This can strain U.S. alliances if American allies blame Washington's confrontational approach to producers for creating this situation. Fifth, the energy transition timeline may be affected. High oil prices generally accelerate the shift to renewables and electric vehicles by making alternatives more economically competitive, but they also impose costs on consumers and can trigger political backlash. The Biden administration's focus on transitioning away from fossil fuels becomes harder to sell politically when gas prices are high. If Saudi-Venezuelan coordination keeps prices elevated, it creates a difficult political dynamic in the U.S. Sixth, geopolitical leverage is shifting. Energy has been a key tool of American influence. We could offer energy security to allies. We could threaten sanctions that cut countries off from energy supplies. We could work with Saudi Arabia to use oil as a strategic instrument. As control over energy markets shifts toward a coalition that includes China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, American leverage diminishes. The domestic political implications in the United States are significant. High gas prices are politically toxic. Presidents get blamed for expensive fuel, even when global markets set prices. If Saudi-Venezuelan coordination keeps oil prices in the $75 to $85 range, gasoline in the United States stays in the $3.50 to $4.50 per gallon range, depending on regional factors. That's not economically catastrophic, but it's politically painful. It also complicates the energy transition message. The administration wants to promote electric vehicles and renewable energy, but when gas is expensive, the political response is often to demand more domestic production and lower prices, not to accelerate the transition away from oil. High prices create political pressure to reverse course on climate policy, open more federal lands to drilling, and prioritize short-term price relief over long-term transformation. The American oil industry faces mixed effects. Higher prices benefit U.S. producers, particularly shale companies in the Permian Basin and other formations. When oil is $80 per barrel, U.S. production is profitable and investment flows in. But if Saudi Arabia and Venezuela coordinate to manage global supply, they can also coordinate to undercut American producers if they choose. A sudden production increase that drops prices to $50 per barrel makes much U.S. shale unprofitable. The threat of that creates uncertainty. There's also the question of spare capacity. Saudi Arabia has historically maintained the ability to increase production quickly in response to supply disruptions. This spare capacity acts as a cushion for global markets. If the Saudis are coordinating with Venezuela and prioritizing revenue over market stability, they may be less willing to deploy that spare capacity to calm markets during crises. This makes global oil markets more volatile and vulnerable to shocks. Let me tell you what options the United States has to respond to this new reality, because they're limited and none are particularly attractive. We could increase domestic production. The U.S. is already producing about 13 million barrels per day, making it one of the world's top producers. We could potentially increase that, but it requires investment, regulatory approvals, and higher prices to make marginal production economic. It also contradicts climate goals to significantly expand fossil fuel production. We could release strategic petroleum reserves. The U.S. has done this before to stabilize prices. But the strategic petroleum reserve has been drawn down significantly. It's at its lowest level since the 1980s after releases in 2021 and 2022. Using reserves is a temporary measure, not a long-term solution. We could try to separate Saudi Arabia from this coordination, offering incentives to restore the traditional relationship. But what do we offer? Saudi Arabia is already wealthy. They're getting what they want from the current arrangement: higher prices, Chinese market access, geopolitical independence. We'd have to offer something more attractive than what they currently have, and it's not clear what that would be. We could attempt regime change in Venezuela, something that's been tried and failed multiple times. The Maduro regime has proven resilient. Military intervention is politically impossible and strategically unwise. Sanctions have failed to dislodge the government. Covert operations have been ineffective. There's no easy path to replacing the Venezuelan government with one more amenable to U.S. interests. We could accelerate the energy transition to reduce oil dependence entirely. This is the long-term solution, but takes decades to fully implement. Electric vehicle adoption is growing, but still represents a small fraction of the vehicle fleet. Renewable energy is expanding, but still supplements rather than replaces fossil fuels in most applications. The transition is happening, but not fast enough to solve the immediate problem of reduced American influence over oil markets. We could accept the new reality and adapt our strategy. This means acknowledging that we no longer control global oil markets, that Saudi Arabia and other producers will act based on their interests rather than ours, and that oil prices will be determined by producer coordination more than consumer preferences. It means developing energy policy that assumes expensive oil rather than assuming we can pressure producers into keeping prices low. Here's what troubles me most about where we are in December 2025. For 50 years, the United States structured its entire Middle East strategy around the Saudi relationship and access to oil. We fought wars partly to ensure energy security. We maintained military bases across the region to protect oil infrastructure and shipping lanes. We provided security guarantees to Gulf monarchies. We built our financial system around the petrodollar. That entire architecture is crumbling. Saudi Arabia is coordinating with Venezuela, a country we've tried to isolate. The petrodollar is dead. Oil increasingly trades in yuan. Producers prioritize their own revenue over consumer preferences. And we have limited ability to change any of it because the incentives for major producers all point in the same direction, away from American influence. This isn't just about energy markets. It's about the erosion of American power in a sector that has been central to our global position since World War II. We're facing a new oil reality where we're less relevant, less influential, and more vulnerable to decisions made by a coalition of producers that includes countries hostile to American interests. The Saudi-Venezuela deal is a symptom of this larger shift. It represents producer solidarity against consumer pressure. It demonstrates that even traditional American partners will pursue independent paths when their interests diverge from ours. It shows that sanctions and pressure can be overcome through alternative partnerships. We're living through the end of American dominance in global energy markets. The new reality is multipolar, with producers coordinating among themselves, China as the dominant customer setting terms, and the United States as one player among many, rather than the orchestrator of the system. The question is whether we'll adapt to this reality or keep trying to reassert control that we no longer possess, because the world has moved on. The oil reality has changed. And we're still operating on assumptions from an era that's already ended.